The year was 1918. America was deep in the trenches of World War I, and the government had unleashed one of the most aggressive campaigns of political repression in the nation's history. Federal agents were arresting thousands of protesters. Neighbors were spying on neighbors. The Constitution seemed suspended in the name of patriotic duty. And in this climate of fear and surveillance, one man stood up in a park in Canton, Ohio, looked out at over 1,000 people, and delivered what would become the most dangerous speech in American history. His name was Eugene Victor Debs. By that summer day in 1918, he was already the most famous socialist in America, a man who had run for president 4 times and commanded the loyalty of millions of working people. But what he said that day would transform him from a controversial political figure into what the government considered the single greatest threat to American security. The words he spoke would land him in federal prison for nearly 3 years and make him a legend that still echoes through the halls of power today. But here's what most people don't know about Eugene Debs. He didn't start as a radical. He didn't begin his life plotting revolution or preaching the overthrow of capitalism. In fact, for most of his early career, he was exactly the kind of American success story that politicians love to celebrate. A hard-working immigrant son who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, served in elected office, and believed wholeheartedly in the promise of American democracy. So, what happened? How did this respectable union leader transform into the man the Justice Department called America's most dangerous enemy? How did someone who started as a cooperative moderate become so threatening that the federal government would throw him in prison simply for giving a speech? The answer lies in a story that reveals everything about power, justice, and the true cost of speaking truth in America. To understand how dangerous Eugene Debs became, you have to understand where he came from. Born on November 5, 1855, in Terre Haute, Indiana, Debs was the son of poor immigrants from the Alsace region of France. His parents, Jean-Daniel and Marguerite, had arrived in America with nothing but hope and the willingness to work. They ran a small grocery store and encouraged their children to value education and intellectual curiosity. But America in the 1860s didn't offer many paths to prosperity for the children of poor immigrants. At just 14 years old, Eugene Debs made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He left high school and walked into the railroad shops of Terre Haute to become a locomotive paint scraper. It was backbreaking, dangerous work that paid almost nothing. But it was also his first glimpse into a world that would shape everything he believed about America. Picture this scene for a moment. A teenage boy, barely old enough to shave, working 12-hour days in the suffocating heat of a railroad shop. The air thick with paint fumes and metal dust. The constant thunder of machinery drowning out conversation. And everywhere around him, men who worked just as hard as he did, but who could barely afford to feed their families. This wasn't the America of opportunity that politicians talked about. This was the America where your hands bled so that someone else could get rich. But young Eugene Debs didn't become bitter. Instead, he became curious. He watched the way the railroad companies treated their workers like disposable machinery. He saw how quickly a man could be fired for the smallest complaint or the slightest injury, and he began to ask questions that would eventually make him the most feared man in America. Why did the people who did the actual work live in poverty, while the people who owned the companies lived in mansions? Why did workers have no voice in the decisions that controlled their lives? And why did the government always seem to side with the wealthy against the poor? By 1875, just 6 years after entering the railroad shops, Debs had found his answer. He helped organize a local lodge of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, one of the first unions for railroad workers. And here's where his story takes an interesting turn. Because Debs didn't start as a revolutionary firebrand calling for the overthrow of capitalism. Instead, he preached cooperation. He believed that workers and bosses could find common ground. He thought that if unions just presented their case reasonably and respectfully, employers would recognize the justice of their cause and voluntarily improve conditions. This philosophy made Debs incredibly popular within the union movement. His speaking ability was legendary even then. Workers would travel hundreds of miles just to hear him talk. And unlike many union leaders who seemed more interested in their own power than their members' welfare, Debs lived modestly and genuinely cared about the men he represented. By 1880, at just 25 years old, he had been elected National Secretary and Treasurer of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen. But Debs' cooperative approach extended beyond labor organizing. He threw himself into mainstream democratic politics with the same energy he brought to union work. In 1879 and 1881, he was elected city clerk of Terre Haute. In 1884, he won a seat in the Indiana State Assembly. He married Catherine Metzel, the daughter of prosperous German immigrants who owned a local drugstore. He was living proof that the American dream could work for the son of poor immigrants. Yet, even during these successful years, cracks were beginning to show in Debs' faith in the system. The more he learned about how power really worked in America, the more he realized that cooperation had limits. The railroad companies weren't interested in treating workers fairly out of the goodness of their hearts. They were interested in maximizing profits, period. And if that meant crushing unions, bribing politicians, or using violence against strikers, they were perfectly willing to do it. The first major test of Debs's cooperative philosophy came in 1888, when he led his union in a 10-month strike against the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. The company had slashed wages and eliminated jobs while paying massive dividends to shareholders. Debs still believed that reasonable negotiation could resolve the dispute. He was wrong. The railroad hired private security forces to intimidate strikers. They brought in replacement workers and used their political connections to pressure local authorities to arrest union leaders. The strike was crushed, and Debs learned a lesson that would transform his entire worldview. The problem wasn't just individual bad companies. The problem was a system that gave all the power to capital and none to labor. The problem was that the courts, the police, and the politicians all served the same masters. And the problem was that workers, no matter how skilled or dedicated, had no real power when they were divided into separate craft unions that could be played against each other. This realization led Debs to one of his most important innovations. Instead of trying to unite the various railroad brotherhoods, which had proven impossible due to their competing interests and prejudices, he decided to create something entirely new. In 1893, he founded the American Railway Union, the first industrial union in United States history. Instead of organizing workers by their specific job skills, the ARU organized them by industry. Every worker employed by the railroads, regardless of whether they were engineers, firemen, brakemen, or shop workers, could join the same union. The concept was revolutionary. For the first time, railroad workers had an organization that could speak for all of them at once, and the results were immediate and spectacular. Within a year, the ARU had grown to over 150,000 members, making it one of the largest labor organizations in the country. Debs had discovered something that would eventually make him dangerous to every powerful interest in America. When working people united across the artificial divisions of craft and skill, they became an unstoppable force. But it was what happened next that would transform Eugene Debs from a successful labor leader into America's most dangerous man. In 1894, workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company went on strike. And when they asked for help, Debs and the American Railway Union made a decision that would change American history forever. They said yes. The Pullman Company was owned by George Pullman, a man who represented everything that was wrong with American capitalism in the 1890s. Pullman had built a company town outside of Chicago where his workers were forced to live. He controlled their housing, their shopping, their entertainment, and even their church. He deducted rent directly from their paychecks and charged them inflated prices for everything they needed to survive. The workers lived like serfs on a feudal estate, except their lord was a businessman instead of a nobleman. When the economic depression of 1893 hit, Pullman cut his workers' wages by 25%, but refused to lower their rents or the prices in his company stores. Workers who complained were fired. Those who tried to organize were blacklisted. And when a delegation approached Pullman to negotiate, he dismissed them and fired several members of the group just for asking. On May 11, 1894, the Pullman workers had enough. They walked off the job and asked the American Railway Union for support. And here's where Eugene Debs made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He could have said no. He could have told the Pullman workers that the ARU only represented railroad employees, not factory workers. He could have avoided a confrontation with one of the most powerful corporations in America. Instead, he said something that would echo through American history. He said that an injury to one worker was an injury to all workers. And on June 26, 1894, Eugene Debs launched the most effective labor action in American history up to that point. The ARU declared a boycott of all trains carrying Pullman cars. And within 4 days, 125,000 railroad workers across the country had joined the action. The boycott was devastating in its effectiveness. Rail traffic ground to a halt across 27 states. Commerce stopped. The mail couldn't get through. And for the first time in American history, working people had demonstrated that they possessed the power to bring the entire economic system to its knees. But they had also demonstrated something else. They had shown the ruling class of America just how dangerous organized workers could be. And the response was swift, brutal, and would transform Eugene Debs from a labor leader into a revolutionary. The story of what happened next reveals everything about how power really works in America. Because when the Pullman boycott threatened the profits of the railroad companies, they didn't just fight back. They enlisted the full power of the federal government to crush the strike. And in doing so, they opened Eugene Debs' eyes to a truth that would make him the most dangerous man in America. The railroad companies didn't waste time with half measures. They went straight to the top. The General Managers Association, representing every major railroad in the Chicago area, marched into Washington with a simple message for President Grover Cleveland. This wasn't just a labor dispute. This was an insurrection. The boycott was interfering with the delivery of federal mail, which made it a federal crime. And if the president didn't act immediately, the entire American economy would collapse. Cleveland didn't hesitate. On July 3, 1894, he ordered federal troops into Chicago. Not state militia, not local police. Federal soldiers with fixed bayonets and orders to break the strike by any means necessary. And here's the crucial detail that most history books gloss over. Cleveland was a Democrat. He was supposed to be the party of the working man. But when it came time to choose between corporate profits and worker solidarity, there was no choice at all. Eugene Debs watched those federal troops march into Chicago and felt something break inside him. This wasn't about law and order. This wasn't about protecting the mail. This was about power showing its true face. Because while the government claimed the strike was violent and dangerous, the violence was coming from one direction. Federal troops fired into crowds of unarmed workers. Private security forces hired by the railroads attacked union members with clubs and guns. And when workers fought back, they were labeled as criminals and terrorists. But Debs himself remained committed to peaceful protest. He sent over 4,000 telegrams to local union chapters, begging them to avoid violence. He knew that any excuse for bloodshed would be used to justify even harsher government repression. He walked through the crowds of angry workers, urging restraint and discipline. He believed that if the union could maintain its moral authority, public opinion would eventually turn in their favor. He was wrong, because the game was rigged from the beginning. On June 29th, Debs spoke at a peaceful rally in Blue Island, Illinois. His message was the same as always: stay united, stay disciplined, stay focused on the goal of justice for working people. After he left, however, some members of the crowd became enraged and set fire to nearby buildings. They derailed a locomotive, and that locomotive happened to be attached to a mail train. The moment that locomotive left the tracks, Eugene Debs became a marked man. The federal government had the justification it needed to destroy not just the strike, but the entire American Railway Union. Federal prosecutors charged Debs and other union leaders with conspiracy to obstruct the mail and interfere with interstate commerce. The irony was perfect. A man who had spent his entire career preaching cooperation and peaceful negotiation was now being prosecuted as a dangerous criminal. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Debs was defended by Clarence Darrow, one of the most brilliant attorneys in American history. Darrow argued that it was the railroad companies, not the union, who had conspired in secret to destroy their opponents. He pointed out that the workers had legitimate grievances and the constitutional right to withdraw their labor. He demonstrated that the violence had been initiated by corporate security forces and federal troops, not by striking workers. None of it mattered. The judge had already made up his mind. The jury was packed with men who had never worked a day in a factory or railroad yard, and the entire legal system was designed to protect property rights above human rights. Eugene Debs was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison for the crime of organizing working people to demand dignity and fair treatment. But here's where the story takes its most important turn, because those 6 months in prison didn't break Eugene Debs. They transformed him. For the first time in his life, he had the opportunity to step back from the daily struggles of union organizing and think deeply about what he had experienced, and what he concluded would make him more dangerous to the American ruling class than any bomb or rifle. The problem wasn't bad employers or corrupt politicians. The problem was capitalism itself. The problem was a system that treated human beings like commodities to be bought and sold in the marketplace. The problem was an economic structure that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a tiny elite while forcing everyone else to compete for scraps. And the problem was a government that existed primarily to protect that system from anyone who challenged it. During his imprisonment at the federal facility in Woodstock, Illinois, Debs read voraciously. He studied the works of Karl Marx and other socialist theorists, but more importantly, he received a visit from Victor Berger, a socialist leader from Milwaukee who brought him a copy of Das Kapital. As Debs worked through Marx's analysis of capitalism, everything began to make sense. The Pullman strike hadn't failed because of bad tactics or poor leadership. It had failed because workers were fighting a system designed to ensure their defeat. When Eugene Debs walked out of prison on November 22, 1895, he was a different man. More than 100,000 people gathered at the railroad station in Chicago to welcome him home. They cheered and waved banners and treated him like a conquering hero. But Debs knew something they didn't know yet. The old Eugene Debs, the one who believed in cooperation and compromise, was dead. In his place stood a revolutionary who understood that American democracy had been hijacked by corporate power, and that only a complete transformation of the economic system could restore it. The crowd that welcomed him expected to hear the familiar themes of union solidarity and worker dignity. Instead, Debs gave them something far more dangerous. He gave them a vision of a completely different America, an America where working people controlled their own destiny, an America where the wealth created by labor belonged to the laborers, an America where democracy meant more than choosing between two candidates who both served the same corporate masters. This wasn't the language of traditional American politics. This was socialism, and Eugene Debs had become its most articulate and charismatic spokesman. Within months of his release, he was traveling across the country, speaking to packed audiences about the need for fundamental change. He didn't just criticize individual companies or corrupt politicians. He attacked the entire system of private ownership of the means of production. But Debs understood something that many other socialists of his era missed. Americans wouldn't embrace socialism as an abstract theory imported from Europe. They would embrace it when they saw it as the fulfillment of American ideals that had been betrayed by corporate power. So, Debs presented socialism as the true heir to the American Revolution. He argued that the Founding Fathers had fought to free America from the tyranny of kings and nobles, and now it was time to free America from the tyranny of millionaires and monopolists. This message resonated with millions of Americans who felt left behind by the rapid industrialization of the late 19th century. Small farmers were being driven off their land by corporate agriculture. Independent craftsmen were being replaced by factory machines. Entire communities were being destroyed by the boom and bust cycles of unregulated capitalism. And everywhere people looked, they saw immense wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, while working families struggled to survive. By 1897, Debs had officially converted to socialism and was helping to build what would become the Socialist Party of America. But he brought something unique to the movement. Unlike many socialist leaders who came from middle-class intellectual backgrounds, Debs had calluses on his hands. He had worked alongside the people he was trying to organize. He spoke their language and understood their struggles from personal experience. More importantly, Debs possessed an almost supernatural ability to connect with audiences. His speaking style combined the passion of an evangelical preacher with the logic of a skilled debater. He could make complex economic theories accessible to people with limited education. He could make socialism sound not like a foreign ideology, but like common sense. And he could make people believe that change was not only possible, but inevitable. In 1900, Debs ran for President of the United States on the Socialist Party ticket for the first time. He received 96,000 votes, a respectable showing for a third-party candidate. 4 years later, that number jumped to 400,000. By 1912, he captured nearly 1 million votes, representing 6% of the national electorate. Eugene Debs had become the most visible socialist in American history, and his message was spreading like wildfire through the industrial cities and farming communities of America. But success brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought danger. Because the more popular Eugene Debs became, the more threatening he appeared to the people who controlled American society. They had tolerated him as a union leader because union leaders could be bought, intimidated, or marginalized. But they couldn't tolerate him as a revolutionary because revolutionaries changed everything. The transformation was complete. The cooperative moderate who had once believed in working within the system had become the man who wanted to replace the system entirely. And when the crisis of World War I arrived, Eugene Debs would discover just how dangerous that made him to the people who held power in America. Power in America. The first signs of trouble came in 1914, when the Great War erupted across Europe. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with the bloodbath consuming the continent. President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on keeping America out of the war, promising that democratic principles and peaceful diplomacy could solve international disputes. But by 1917, everything had changed. The profits to be made from selling weapons and supplies to the warring nations were too tempting. The opportunity to establish America as the dominant world power was too attractive, and the excuse to crush dissent at home was too convenient. When Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany in April 1917, Eugene Debs understood immediately what was really happening. This wasn't about making the world safe for democracy, as Wilson claimed. This was about making the world safe for American capitalism. The same corporate interests that had crushed the Pullman strike were now orchestrating a global conflict that would generate unprecedented profits while working-class boys died in foreign trenches. But Debs faced a terrible dilemma. Speaking out against the war would make him a target of the most repressive government campaign in American history. The Wilson administration had already pushed through the Espionage Act, which made it illegal to interfere with military recruitment or encourage resistance to the draft. Federal agents were arresting anyone who criticized the war effort. Newspapers that printed anti-war articles were banned from the mail. Socialist leaders across the country were being dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. Debs could have stayed quiet. He was 52 years old and in declining health. He had already sacrificed decades of his life to the cause of working people. He could have retreated to his home in Terre Haute and waited for the madness to pass. Many of his friends and advisers begged him to do exactly that. They warned him that speaking out would mean prison or worse. They reminded him that the Socialist Party needed his leadership and couldn't afford to lose him to government persecution. But Eugene Debs had spent 23 years learning that silence in the face of injustice was complicity. He had watched the federal government side with corporations against workers during the Pullman strike. He had seen how quickly constitutional rights disappeared when they interfered with business profits. And now he was watching young men from working-class families march off to die in a war that would enrich the same people who had spent decades exploiting their labor. The decision to speak out wasn't sudden or impulsive. Debs agonized over it for months. He consulted with Socialist Party leaders. He studied the language of the Espionage Act, looking for ways to express his opposition without technically breaking the law. He understood that once he crossed that line, there would be no going back. The government would destroy him if they could, and his effectiveness as a political leader would be finished. Yet Debs also understood something that most politicians never grasp. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is lose everything for the right cause. Sometimes, the greatest victory is the defeat that exposes the true nature of power. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can become is a martyr, whose persecution reveals the hypocrisy of those who claim to defend freedom while crushing dissent. In the spring of 1918, Debs made his choice. He began planning a series of speeches that would challenge the war directly, not through coded language or careful euphemisms, but with the same clarity and passion that had made him the voice of American socialism. He would tell the truth about what the war really meant, regardless of the consequences. The opportunity came when the Socialist Party of Ohio invited him to speak at a gathering in Canton. The local socialists had been organizing against the war, and several of their leaders had been arrested. The meeting was partly a protest rally and partly a show of solidarity with imprisoned comrades. It was exactly the kind of event that federal agents were monitoring closely. Debs knew he was walking into a trap. Intelligence reports later revealed that Justice Department operatives had been tracking his movements for weeks. They knew about the Canton speech in advance and had made preparations to arrest him the moment he said anything that could be construed as seditious. Government stenographers were positioned in the crowd, ready to record every word. Federal prosecutors had already drawn up indictments, needing only to fill in the specific charges. But Debs also knew that this might be his last chance to speak freely to the American people. Once the government decided to silence him, opportunities like this would disappear. If he was going to challenge the war machine that was devouring young lives for corporate profit, it had to be now. If he was going to expose the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while destroying it at home, it had to be here. The morning of June 16, 1918, was sweltering in Canton, Ohio. The temperature was already climbing toward 90 degrees when Debs arrived at Nemesilla Park. More than 1,200 people had gathered to hear him speak, despite the obvious dangers of attending such an event. They came from steel mills and coal mines, from farms and factories, from immigrant neighborhoods and rural communities. They were the people who had always formed the backbone of Debs' movement, and they were willing to risk government persecution to hear his message. As Debs approached the wooden bandstand, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. Federal agents moved through the crowd, checking draft cards and taking notes on anyone who seemed suspicious. A government stenographer sat directly in front of the platform, his pencil poised to capture every potentially seditious phrase. Local police officers stood at strategic positions around the park, ready to arrest anyone who became too enthusiastic in their response to Debs' words. But the crowd itself radiated defiance. These were people who had watched their sons and brothers disappear into the military machine. They had seen their wages frozen while corporate profits soared. They had witnessed the systematic destruction of civil liberties in the name of patriotic duty. And they had come to hear the one man in America who was still willing to tell them the truth about what was happening to their country. Debs stepped to the front of the bandstand and looked out over the sea of faces. He was nearly bald now, his hair reduced to wisps of gray around his ears. His face was gaunt from years of poor health and constant stress, but his eyes still burned with the same intensity that had made him legendary as a speaker, and when he began to talk, his voice carried across the park with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. He started carefully, praising the local socialist leaders who had been imprisoned for their opposition to the war. He spoke about the courage required to stand up for your principles when the government was determined to crush all dissent. He reminded the audience that the same Constitution that supposedly justified American involvement in the war also guaranteed the right of free speech and peaceful assembly. But as Debs warmed to his theme, his language became more direct and more dangerous. He talked about the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy in Europe while denying it to millions of Americans. He pointed out that the wealthy men who had pushed for war would never see their own sons in the trenches. He reminded the crowd that working people had never been consulted about whether they wanted to fight and die for the profits of their oppressors. Then Debs said the words that would seal his fate and secure his place in history. "The working class have never yet had a voice in declaring war," he declared, his voice rising above the summer heat. "If war is right, let it be declared by the people who have your lives to lose." The government stenographer's pencil moved frantically across his notebook. Federal agents in the crowd exchanged meaningful glances. And Eugene Debs continued speaking, knowing that every word was bringing him closer to a prison cell but unable to stop himself from telling the truth as he saw it. He talked about the class nature of military service, pointing out that rich men's sons could buy their way out of combat while poor men's sons died in foreign mud. He criticized the Espionage Act as a tool for silencing legitimate political opposition. He expressed solidarity with political prisoners who had been jailed for expressing anti-war views. And through it all, he maintained that real patriotism required opposing unjust wars, not blindly supporting them. The speech lasted nearly 2 hours. When it ended, the crowd erupted in sustained applause that could be heard blocks away. People wept openly, understanding that they had just witnessed something historic and terrible. They had heard Eugene Debs deliver what might be his final address as a free man, and they had watched him choose principle over safety, truth over survival, and moral courage over political calculation. Within days, the machinery of government repression began to turn. Federal prosecutors in Cleveland reviewed the stenographer's notes and found exactly what they were looking for. Debs had clearly violated the Espionage Act by discouraging military recruitment and expressing sympathy for convicted seditionists. The case was ironclad, the conviction virtually guaranteed. On June 30, 1918, just 2 weeks after his speech in Canton, Eugene Debs was arrested at his hotel in Cleveland. Federal agents escorted him to jail without ceremony or explanation. The man, who had once been welcomed by crowds of 100,000, was now treated like a common criminal. The transformation was complete. Eugene Debs had become exactly what the government called him, America's most dangerous man. But danger, as Debs had learned over his long career, was often just another word for truth. And the truth he represented was more threatening to the established order than any bomb or bullet. Because Eugene Debs had shown ordinary Americans that they didn't have to accept poverty, exploitation, and war as the natural order of things. He had demonstrated that working people could organize themselves into a force capable of challenging the most powerful interests in society. And most dangerously of all, he had proven that someone could maintain their principles even when it cost them everything. The government could arrest Eugene Debs. They could put him on trial and send him to prison. They could destroy his health and ruin his political career. But they couldn't destroy the idea he represented. They couldn't silence the voice that spoke for millions of Americans who had been told they didn't matter. And they couldn't stop the movement that would continue long after Eugene Debs himself was gone. The trial in Cleveland would be a spectacle unlike anything American jurisprudence had ever seen. Because Eugene Debs was about to do something that would transform him from a dangerous radical into an immortal symbol of resistance to tyranny. He was about to defend not just himself, but the very idea that democracy meant more than the freedom to choose which group of millionaires would rule over you. The trial of Eugene Debs began on September 9, 1918, in the federal courthouse in Cleveland, Ohio. Outside, the Great War was entering its final phase, with American troops dying by the thousands in the forests of France. Inside, the government was conducting its own war against the idea that Americans had the right to question their leaders during times of crisis. The courtroom was packed with federal agents, prosecutors, and carefully selected observers who could be trusted not to cause disturbances. The press was there too, but most newspapers had already decided that Debs was guilty before the trial even began. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the unspoken understanding that this wasn't really about one man's speech in a park. This was about whether dissent would be allowed to exist in America. District Attorney Edwin Wirtz opened the case with the kind of patriotic rhetoric that had become standard during the war years. He painted Debs as a traitor who had deliberately undermined the war effort at a time when American boys were fighting and dying for democracy. He read excerpts from the Canton speech, emphasizing every phrase that could be interpreted as discouraging military service or expressing sympathy for convicted seditionists. But Wirtz's most damaging argument wasn't about what Debs had said that day in Canton. It was about who Eugene Debs had become. The prosecutor reminded the jury that this wasn't some unknown agitator speaking to a handful of radicals. This was the most famous socialist in America, a man whose words carried enormous influence among working people. When someone like Eugene Debs spoke against the war, Wirtz argued, his influence could inspire thousands of others to resist the draft or sabotage the war effort. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They had the stenographer's transcript of every word Debs had spoken. They had federal agents who testified about the hostile reaction of the crowd. They had evidence that Debs had praised imprisoned socialists who had been convicted under the same Espionage Act. Most importantly, they had the law itself, which made it illegal to interfere with military recruitment or encourage resistance to the draft. Debs' defense team, led by the brilliant Clarence Darrow, faced an almost impossible task. They couldn't deny that Debs had given the speech. They couldn't argue that his words weren't covered by the Espionage Act. And they couldn't claim that Debs didn't understand the potential consequences of what he was saying. So instead, they decided to put the entire system of wartime repression on trial. Darrow argued that the Espionage Act itself was unconstitutional, a violation of the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech. He pointed out that the law was being used selectively to silence political opponents while allowing pro-war speakers to say anything they wanted. He demonstrated that the government's own witnesses had engaged in far more inflammatory rhetoric than anything Debs had said in Canton. But Darrow's most powerful argument was about the nature of patriotism itself. He reminded the jury that America had been founded by men who resisted their government when they believed it was wrong. He quoted Thomas Jefferson's declaration that dissent was the highest form of patriotism. He argued that true loyalty to American principles required opposing unjust laws, even when they were passed by democratically elected representatives. The defense called witnesses who testified about Debs' character and his lifelong commitment to peaceful change. They brought in labor leaders who spoke about his role in improving conditions for working people. They presented evidence that Debs had consistently opposed violence throughout his career, even when his own followers were being attacked by government forces. Yet, everyone in that courtroom understood that legal arguments and character witnesses weren't really what mattered. What mattered was that Eugene Debs represented something that couldn't be allowed to exist during wartime. He represented the idea that ordinary Americans could think for themselves about whether their government's policies were just. He represented the possibility that working people might refuse to fight in wars that served only the interests of their oppressors. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Debs himself was the most compelling witness for his own defense. When he took the stand on September 18th, the courtroom fell completely silent. Here was the man who had terrified the ruling class of America, who had been described in newspaper editorials as more dangerous than any foreign enemy. And what they saw was a thin, aging idealist whose only weapon was his unshakable belief in the dignity of working people. Debs spoke for nearly 2 hours, and his words would be remembered long after the verdicts of more famous trials were forgotten. He didn't deny the charges against him. Instead, he explained why he had been compelled to speak out despite knowing the consequences. He talked about his journey from cooperative unionist to revolutionary socialist, describing how each confrontation with corporate power had stripped away another layer of his faith in the existing system. He spoke about the Pullman strike and how federal troops had been used to crush working people who were fighting for basic dignity. He described his imprisonment and the revelations that had come to him during those months of reflection. He explained his conversion to socialism not as an embrace of foreign ideology, but as a return to the original American values of equality and justice. But most powerfully, Debs spoke about the war itself and why he believed it was his duty to oppose it. He pointed out that the same corporations that had exploited American workers for decades were now profiting enormously from the manufacture of weapons and military supplies. He noted that the sons of wealthy families were safely ensconced in officer training programs while working-class boys filled the ranks of combat units. He talked about democracy and what it really meant. Not the hollow ritual of choosing between candidates who all served the same corporate masters, but the substantive participation of ordinary people in the decisions that affected their lives. How could America claim to be fighting for democracy in Europe, Debs asked, when millions of Americans had no real voice in their own government? Then, Debs said something that would echo through American courtrooms for generations to come. Looking directly at the jury, he declared, "While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free." The words hung in the air like an electric charge. Here was a man who had been offered every opportunity to save himself by moderating his views or accepting the legitimacy of the system he opposed. Instead, he was choosing to identify completely with the most despised and powerless members of society. He was saying that no one could be truly free while others remained in chains. Debs continued his address by explaining his understanding of socialism, not as a foreign conspiracy but as the fulfillment of American ideals. He argued that the founders of the Republic had fought to free Americans from the tyranny of hereditary aristocracy, and now it was time to free them from the tyranny of corporate oligarchy. He painted a vision of an America where working people controlled their own destiny, where democracy extended beyond politics into the workplace, where human needs took precedence over private profit. He spoke about the international nature of working-class solidarity, explaining that he felt more kinship with a German or Russian worker than with an American millionaire. This wasn't treason, he argued, but simply recognition that ordinary people everywhere shared common interests that transcended the artificial boundaries drawn by their rulers. As Debs concluded his address, he returned to the charges against him. He admitted that he had opposed the war and would continue to oppose it as long as he drew breath. He acknowledged that he had expressed sympathy for imprisoned socialists and would do so again. He confessed that he had encouraged working people to think critically about the system that governed their lives, but he refused to apologize for any of it. Instead, he turned the tables on his accusers, arguing that the real criminals were those who sent young men to die for corporate profits while wrapping themselves in the flag. The real traitors were those who destroyed constitutional rights in the name of protecting democracy. The real enemies of America were those who used the machinery of government to crush anyone who dared to speak for the powerless. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was inevitable, given the political climate and the clear language of the Espionage Act. Eugene Debs was guilty on all 3 counts of violating federal law by interfering with military recruitment and encouraging resistance to the draft. Judge David Westenhaver sentenced Debs to 10 years in federal prison and the permanent loss of his citizenship. The punishment was designed not just to silence Debs personally, but to send a message to anyone else who might consider challenging the government during wartime. The era of dissent was over. The age of conformity had begun. But something unexpected happened as the sentence was pronounced. Instead of breaking down or pleading for mercy, Eugene Debs stood straighter and seemed almost relieved. The long struggle was finally over. He had said what needed to be said, regardless of the cost. He had remained true to his principles even when it meant sacrificing everything he had worked for throughout his life. As federal marshals led him away in shackles, Debs turned to his supporters in the courtroom gallery and smiled. It was the smile of a man who had discovered that there were things more important than freedom, more valuable than life itself, more precious than any personal comfort or safety. He had found the courage to become truly dangerous to those who held power through the oppression of others. The newspapers that had once treated Debs as a legitimate political figure now portrayed him as a convicted criminal whose influence had been permanently destroyed. Editorial writers celebrated his downfall as proof that America would not tolerate disloyalty during times of crisis. Government officials congratulated themselves on removing a dangerous radical from the political scene. Yet, even as they celebrated, Debs' enemies understood that something had gone wrong with their victory. The trial had been designed to discredit socialism by exposing its leading spokesman as a traitor. Instead, it had created a martyr whose moral authority transcended any political movement. Debs had transformed his defeat into something that looked suspiciously like triumph. Word of the trial spread through working-class communities across America like wildfire. In factory towns and mining camps, in immigrant neighborhoods and farming villages, people who had never heard of socialism before began asking questions about the system that would imprison a man for speaking his conscience. They read accounts of Debs' courtroom address and wondered whether he might be right about the true nature of American democracy. The government had succeeded in silencing Eugene Debs, but they had failed to silence his message. In fact, they had amplified it beyond anything he could have achieved through normal political channels. By making him a prisoner of conscience, they had made him more dangerous than he had ever been as a free man. As Debs was transported to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, he carried with him the knowledge that his real work was just beginning. Prison might end his career as a political organizer, but it would begin his transformation into something far more powerful. He was about to become a living symbol of resistance to injustice, a reminder that some principles were worth any sacrifice. The man who entered Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in April 1919 was no longer just Eugene Debs, socialist politician. He was now Eugene Debs, America's most dangerous man, whose very existence challenged the legitimacy of a system built on the exploitation of the many by the few. And from his prison cell, he would continue to inspire millions of Americans to question everything they had been told about freedom, democracy, and the true meaning of patriotism. The story of Eugene Debs was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Because the most dangerous thing about dangerous men isn't what they do when they're free. It's what they inspire others to do long after they're gone. Prison was supposed to break Eugene Debs. The federal penitentiary in Atlanta was designed to crush the spirit of men who thought they could challenge the established order. The stone walls were 30 feet high, topped with razor wire that gleamed in the Georgia sun. The cells were 8 feet by 10 feet, barely large enough for a cot, a sink, and the dreams that kept dangerous men alive in the darkness. But something extraordinary happened when Eugene Debs walked through those prison gates on April 13th, 1919. Instead of disappearing into the anonymity that the government had planned for him, he became more visible than ever. Instead of being forgotten by the American people, he became a household name. And instead of his influence diminishing, it spread across the country like a fire that no amount of repression could extinguish. The warden at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary had been warned about his new prisoner. This wasn't some ordinary criminal who could be intimidated into submission. This was the man who had commanded the loyalty of millions of American workers, who had run for president and received nearly 1 million votes, who had been dangerous enough that the federal government had bent the Constitution to silence him. Special precautions would be necessary. Yet, within days of his arrival, something unprecedented began happening. Other prisoners, men who had never shown interest in politics or social causes, started gathering around Debs during exercise periods. They wanted to hear him talk about the world outside the walls, about the ideas that had made him famous, about the vision of America that had landed him in prison. Word spread through the cell blocks that the famous Eugene Debs was not just another inmate. He was still the same man who had stood up for working people when no one else would. The prison administration tried to isolate him, moving him from cell block to prevent him from building relationships with other inmates. But isolation only made Debs more intriguing to his fellow prisoners. They passed notes between cells, sharing fragments of conversations they had overheard. They talked about this strange man who treated everyone with dignity, regardless of what crime had brought them to Atlanta. Because that was the thing about Eugene Debs that his enemies had never understood. His power didn't come from his position or his wealth or his connections to influential people. It came from his absolute conviction that every human being possessed inherent dignity and worth. In prison, surrounded by men whom society had written off as irredeemable, Debs found the same potential for goodness that he had always seen in factory workers and farmers. He organized informal education classes, teaching literacy to inmates who had never learned to read. He mediated disputes between prisoners who came from different backgrounds, and might have otherwise fought each other. He wrote letters for men whose families had given up on them, helping them maintain connections to the outside world. And through it all, he continued to preach the same message that had made him dangerous in the first place. The system that had imprisoned these men was the same system that had exploited their labor when they were free. The judges who had sentenced them came from the same class of people who profited from keeping working families in poverty. The laws they had broken were written by legislators who served corporate interests rather than human needs. Prison was just another form of the oppression that had shaped their entire lives. Eugene Debs died on October 20th, 1926, but the ideas that made him dangerous never died. They live on in every worker who refuses to accept poverty as their fate, in every voice raised against injustice, in every person who chooses principle over profit. The government thought they could silence him by putting him behind bars. Instead, they created a legend that still haunts the powerful today. Because the most dangerous thing about dangerous men isn't the threat they pose while they're alive. It's the questions they leave behind for future generations to answer.